What happens when a thoughtless joke about betrayal shatters a marriage in seconds? He didn't argue, didn't yell, didn't even beg for an explanation. He simply walked away, straight to a lawyer's office. How did my words, meant to sting for a laugh, turn into the weapon that cost me my home, my children, and my dignity? My name is Aurelia Dawn. I'm 33 years old, and I ruined my own marriage with a joke I thought was clever. I was sitting in my parents' dining room with my brother and a few friends when I laughed and said that even Thomas's best friend Ethan had tasted me once. I said it for shock value, for the laugh, not thinking about who was listening in the next room. The moment the words left my mouth, the silence was heavier than I expected. My father coughed, my mother looked down at her plate, and then I realized Thomas had heard everything. He didn't yell or demand an explanation. He just stood in the doorway, eyes fixed on me like he'd finally understood something, and then he walked out without a word. I told myself he'd come back like always, that he was too weak to leave for real. I told my family he was overreacting and that men should be able to handle a little honesty. I even convinced myself it was his fault for being so insecure. But what I didn't know was that Thomas wasn't walking away in anger. He was walking straight into a lawyer's office. It started in the living room of my parents' house, a place where I always felt like the star of the show. We had gathered for Sunday dinner, something my mother insisted on keeping as a tradition, even though most of us were too busy or too tired to care anymore. I went because it gave me a chance to hold court, to remind everyone that I was different, that I had outgrown the small life Thomas clung to. He never liked those dinners. He said they made him feel like an outsider, as if my family tolerated him only because of me. I used to roll my eyes at that. I told him he was paranoid, that they liked him just fine, but deep down, I knew he wasn't wrong. My brother Marcus always found a way to jab at him, little jokes about his work boots or his quiet voice. My father barely spoke to him, always more interested in asking me about my job. My mother would force a polite smile, but I could tell she didn't see him as a match for me. And I encouraged it, because it suited my narrative, that I had settled, that I deserved better. That evening was no different. Marcus had just made a comment about how Thomas probably didn't even know how to order wine at a restaurant, and I laughed louder than necessary. I leaned back in my chair, glass in hand, and told them all that I had to put up with so much dullness at home that sometimes I wondered if I was slowly disappearing. My father chuckled, my mother frowned but said nothing, and Marcus smirked. I felt powerful, admired, as if my complaints were proof that I was too sharp for the life I was given. That was when the word slipped out. I said, almost without thinking, that at least Ethan, Thomas's best friend, had once tasted me. I said it like a punchline. I wanted the shock, the laughter, the gasp. And I got it. Marcus laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. My father's eyes went wide, then narrowed like he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. My mother pressed her lips together so tight they turned white. For a second I felt triumphant, like I had thrown a grenade into the middle of the table and everyone had to watch me glow in the fire. But then the silence stretched. I thought they were stunned by my boldness, but the air shifted, heavy and suffocating. That was when I turned my head and saw Thomas standing in the doorway. He must have come in from the kitchen, maybe to ask if we needed more water, maybe just to sit down. Whatever the reason, he had been there long enough to hear every word. His face wasn't angry. It wasn't even surprised. It was blank, like the final piece of a puzzle had clicked into place. He didn't speak, didn't ask for clarification, didn't shout. He just looked at me for a long moment, then turned and walked out. The front door closed softly behind him. I laughed nervously, brushing it off, telling everyone he was being dramatic. I said he was too sensitive, that he couldn't handle a simple joke. Marcus nodded, saying Thomas had always been uptight. My father shook his head, muttering that I was reckless. My mother whispered my name in warning, but I waved her off. I told them he would get over it, that he always did. I poured myself another glass of wine and pretended it didn't matter. Later that night, when I came home, the house was quiet. His boots were by the door, his jacket still on the hook, but he wasn't there. I called out for him, but there was no answer. I told myself he'd gone for a drive, that he'd come back once he cooled down. I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, messaging Ethan half-jokingly about how his name had come up at dinner. He didn't reply right away, which annoyed me. When Thomas still hadn't returned by midnight, I went to bed without him, irritated rather than worried. The next morning, he was in the kitchen making coffee when I came down. He didn't greet me. He didn't ask about dinner. He didn't say a word. He handed me my mug the way he always did, then went about his routine as if I wasn't there. I told myself that silence was proof of weakness, that he was sulking instead of fighting. I said out loud that he was acting like a child, that no real man would let one comment bother him. He just looked at me once, expression flat, then walked out the door to work. That week, I played the victim to anyone who would listen. At work, I told my co-workers that Thomas had overheard something private, that he was blowing it out of proportion. I said he was trying to control me by sulking. My friends nodded, telling me I was too much woman for a man like him. My parents were less enthusiastic. My father avoided the subject, and my mother told me quietly that I had crossed a line. Marcus still joked about it, though even he seemed uneasy now. I ignored all of them. I told myself I had the right to say what I wanted, but in the back of my mind, there was that image of Thomas's face in the doorway, silent, expressionless, but not defeated. I brushed it away each time it surfaced, convincing myself he would come crawling back, desperate to keep me. I never imagined that silence could mean something else entirely. I never thought it could mean he was already making plans. The first crack came when I noticed he wasn't asking me where I was going anymore. For years he had always asked, even if it was casual. Now he just let me leave without a word. He stopped eating dinner with me, taking his plate into the other room. He spoke to the kids, helped with homework, tucked them in, but barely acknowledged me. I told myself he was trying to guilt me into apologizing, that he was punishing me. I told the children he was moody, that he just needed space. They looked at me strangely, but I dismissed it. Looking back, that was the beginning of the end. I thought I had won. I thought his silence was proof he couldn't handle me, that I was in control. But really, he had already shifted the balance. While I laughed and bragged, he was gathering strength in a way I didn't recognize. He was preparing for a fight I didn't even know had started. The restaurant was crowded that Friday night, but I loved the way the noise wrapped around me, making me feel important. Thomas hated these outings with friends, but I insisted we go. I said it was healthy for couples to be social, though really I wanted an audience. I wanted people to see me sitting next to Ethan, to watch me lean in close when he told a story, to laugh too loudly at his jokes. Thomas sat across from me, quiet, sipping his drink while the others filled the space with chatter. I told myself he looked small there, like a man out of place among people with bigger lives. That was the story I wanted everyone to believe, that he wasn't enough, that I had grown beyond him. At one point, one of the women teased me about always sitting near Ethan. I grinned and said it was because Thomas didn't mind sharing. The table laughed and I felt the heat of triumph. I saw Thomas glance at me, but he didn't speak. He didn't defend himself, didn't protest, didn't even look angry. He just returned his eyes to his glass. That silence annoyed me more than words would have. I wanted him to rise, to fight, to prove me right that he was jealous and insecure. Instead, he gave me nothing, and I filled the void by leaning closer to Ethan, exaggerating my smile. Later, when the group ordered dessert, I made another dig. I told them Thomas would probably fall asleep halfway through because that's what he did at home. More laughter, more attention. I said these things because it made me feel powerful, like I had the upper hand in a game he didn't even realize he was playing. My brother Marcus, who had tagged along, clapped me on the shoulder and said I was hilarious. Thomas excused himself to the restroom, and when he came back, he looked like a man who had decided something but wasn't going to say what. After dinner, Ethan offered to walk me to the car. Thomas was unlocking the doors, and I waved Ethan off, telling him Thomas didn't mind. Again, no response. just silence. I told myself he was sulking, that he would eventually snap. I wanted that explosion because I thought it would prove how much he cared, how much I mattered. But he never gave me the satisfaction. When we got home, I kicked off my heels and waited for the fight. He sat at the kitchen table, calm, almost too calm. I asked if he was going to sulk all night. He didn't reply. He just looked at me with those steady eyes and said I would understand soon. That was it. No anger, no raised voice, just that one sentence. I laughed, called him dramatic, and went upstairs. Over the next few days, his silence turned deliberate. He still helped the children with their routines, still paid the bills, still kept the house in order. But he didn't engage with me. If I asked a question, he answered in as few words as possible. If I mocked him, he didn't react. I told myself he was too weak to confront me, too afraid to lose me. I told Marcus he was pouting, and Marcus said Thomas needed to grow a backbone. That only fed my arrogance. My parents reacted differently. My father asked me quietly what I had really said at that dinner. My mother told me Thomas looked broken when he left their house the other night. I brushed them off, claiming he was playing the victim. They frowned but didn't press further. Elaine, his mother, refused to speak to me at all. She told Thomas she wouldn't come to any family events if I was there. I said she was bitter and old-fashioned, but deep down, I felt a twinge of unease. Still, I kept telling myself I was winning. The more he stayed silent, the more I thought I had the power. I didn't realize that silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. I was waiting for a fight, but he was already moving pieces I couldn't see. And when I finally learned what he meant by understand soon, it was too late. At work, the whispers started small but grew louder every week. A coworker asked me if it was true that I was closer to my husband's best friend than to my husband. I laughed it off, saying people love to exaggerate, but the look on her face told me she didn't believe my dismissal. I could feel the shift whenever I walked into the break room. Conversations paused, eyes followed me. I convinced myself it was jealousy. They envied me for having a husband at home, and a man like Ethan still giving me attention. That was the story I told myself, even when Ethan himself began to pull away. Ethan stopped texting back as quickly. When I suggested meeting for drinks, he said he was busy. When I cornered him at a gathering, he kept glancing around like he didn't want to be seen with me. I told him he was being ridiculous, that Thomas wasn't going to do anything. Ethan said nothing, just shrugged and walked away. His silence mirrored Thomas's, and I hated it. I needed someone to feed my sense of control, and suddenly, both of them were leaving me hungry. I shifted my focus back to my parents, spinning the story so they would take my side. I told them Thomas had been sulking for weeks, barely speaking to me, making me feel like the bad guy. I said he was controlling, that he wanted me to sit quietly at home and never laugh too loudly or talk to anyone. My father frowned but didn't say much. My mother looked at me with a sadness I pretended not to notice. She told me I might be pushing things too far, but I waved her off, saying she didn't understand what it was like to live with a man who dragged you down. Marcus still laughed at my jokes, though even he was beginning to look uneasy. He asked once if I really meant what I'd said about Ethan. I rolled my eyes and told him not to be so serious, that it was just a joke. But the question hung between us, making me defensive. For the first time, I felt him doubting me, and that stung worse than Thomas's silence. At home, the children were starting to notice. Mila asked why Daddy didn't talk to me much anymore. I told her he was busy, that he just had too much on his mind with work. Jacob nodded, but I could see the confusion in his little face. Thomas never corrected me in front of them, never exposed me, but his quiet presence made my words feel hollow. He played with them, laughed with them, helped with homework, while I sat scrolling on my phone, trying to drown out the sense that I was losing ground. Then came the evening. He dropped them off after a weekend with his mother. I was standing in the kitchen when he walked in with Mila and Jacob trailing behind him, holding their overnight bags. He kissed them both on the forehead, helped them put their things away, and then walked to the counter. Without looking at me, he placed a sealed envelope there. He said nothing, just met my eyes for one long second before turning to leave. I called after him, demanding to know what it was, but the door closed behind him before I got an answer. I ripped the envelope open, expecting maybe a note, some pathetic plea, or perhaps a warning. Instead, I found copies of bank statements, phone records, and screenshots of messages I thought I had hidden. My stomach twisted as I flipped through them, each page a reminder that he had been watching, collecting, preparing. At the back was a cover letter from a lawyer, my name typed neatly at the top. My hands shook as I read the words. Petition for divorce, custody arrangements, financial disclosures. The room spun. For the first time, I realized his silence hadn't been weakness. It had been calculation. While I was busy performing for laughs, he had been building a case. I thought I was humiliating him, but he was already setting the stage to dismantle me. I drove to Ethan's apartment that night with the envelope still clutched in my hand. I was shaking with anger, but more than that, I was terrified. I needed him to tell me it was nothing, that Thomas couldn't do anything, that this was all just paper meant to scare me. When he opened the door, I shoved the documents toward him, demanding he look. He barely glanced at them before saying he didn't want to be involved. I told him he had to stand with me, that Thomas would try to drag us both down if he didn't. Ethan crossed his arms and said it was my problem, not his. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, just told me not to call him again if I planned to make scenes. Then he shut the door in my face. I stood in the hallway staring at the closed door, the reality settling in. Ethan wasn't going to protect me. He wasn't going to fight for me. He had been an escape, nothing more, and now that escape was gone. I drove home in silence, my mind racing with excuses, rehearsing lines I could throw at Thomas to make him back down. When I walked through the front door, he was sitting at the kitchen table, the children already asleep upstairs. I threw the papers in front of him and demanded to know what he thought he was doing. He didn't look at me. He just sipped his tea and said it was already in motion. I shouted that he was cruel, that he was destroying the family, that he was trying to ruin the children's lives just to punish me. He finally looked up then, his face calm, and said only that he was protecting them. That answer enraged me. I told him he was selfish, that he was twisting the truth to make himself look noble. I insisted he was punishing me for wanting more from life, that he couldn't stand the idea of me being admired by others. He didn't argue, he didn't defend himself. He just sat there, watching me unravel, and the silence was worse than any accusation. My parents were no help. When I called them, crying, my father sighed and said, I should have known this would happen eventually. My mother said quietly that Thomas had always been a good man and that maybe I had gone too far. Marcus stopped answering my texts altogether. Even my friends, the ones who once laughed at my jokes, now avoided me. No one wanted to be linked to the mess I had created. I clung to the children as proof I still had control. I told them Daddy was trying to hurt me, that he wanted to take them away because he didn't love me anymore. Mila frowned and asked if that was true. Jacob just hugged his stuffed toy tighter. Later, I overheard Mila whispering to her brother that Daddy seemed happier when they stayed at his place. That cut deeper than Thomas's silence. The final blow came a week later, when I tried calling Ethan again. His number went straight to voicemail. When I messaged him, the texts bounced back. He had blocked me. Panic set in, not because I missed him, but because without him, I had no one to share the blame with. Everything pointed back to me, and I was standing alone. That night, I sat at the table across from Thomas again, begging him to stop this, telling him we could work it out. He didn't raise his eyes from the paperwork in front of him. I told him he was destroying us, and he said very quietly that I had done that myself. It was then I realized no amount of gaslighting, no twisting of words, could undo what I had set in motion. He wasn't fighting me anymore. He had already won, and I was only just beginning to see how completely. The courthouse was colder than I imagined, not in temperature, but in the way the walls seemed to press in on me. I walked in wearing my best dress, head held high, determined to show everyone that I wasn't intimidated. I told myself appearances mattered, that if I looked unshaken, maybe the judge and lawyers would see me as the victim. Thomas was already there, sitting beside his lawyer, dressed simply but neatly. He didn't look at me, he didn't fidget, he just waited, calm and unreadable, and something about that stillness unsettled me more than anger ever could. When the proceedings began, his lawyer laid everything out piece by piece. Bank records showing how I had drained our joint account for dinners and outings, screenshots of messages that I thought I had deleted, messages between me and Ethan that made me sound reckless, careless, cruel. Witness accounts, even from friends, about my jokes at Thomas's expense. Each detail landed like a stone in my stomach. I wanted to object, to scream that it was unfair, that it wasn't the full story. But each time I opened my mouth, my own lawyer gave me a warning glance, silently telling me not to make it worse. I tried to remind myself that this was just paperwork, that no one could actually take my children from me. But then the judge asked about custody. Thomas's lawyer spoke of stability, of how the children thrived in his care, how they had consistent routines and a calm environment with him. He referenced statements from their teachers, notes about how Mila seemed brighter, more focused, after weekends with her father. He mentioned how Jacob had told a school counselor that Daddy helped him feel safe. I wanted to object, to say I was their mother, that they belonged with me. Instead, I sat there, burning, while the judge nodded. When it was my turn, I tried to frame Thomas as cold and controlling. I said he shut me out, that he punished me with silence, that he made me feel invisible. I insisted I had only made jokes to cope with how small he made me feel. My words sounded strong in my head, but when I spoke them aloud, they sounded hollow. The judge's eyes narrowed, and I realized I wasn't convincing anyone. Outside the courtroom during recess, I called my parents, expecting them to back me up. My father answered, his voice tired, and said maybe I should stop fighting and accept what was happening. My mother told me she still loved me, but that she couldn't defend the choices I had made. Marcus didn't respond at all. Even the people who once clapped for my jokes were nowhere to be found. I felt the walls closing in, yet I still told myself I could spin this if I tried hard enough. Back inside, Thomas remained composed. He didn't gloat. He didn't even look at me. He let his lawyer speak for him, and each sentence painted him as the steady, reliable father and husband I had once dismissed as boring. I hated that it was true. The final mediation session was the hardest. The lawyers sat across from each other at a long table, with us in between. Papers slid back and forth. Custody schedules, financial disclosures, property divisions. Every page stripped more from me. My lawyer whispered that Thomas's terms were reasonable, that fighting them would only make things worse. Reasonable. That word felt like poison. I wanted to slam my fists on the table and scream that he was stealing my life. But all I could do was sit there while signatures were drawn up. When the discussion turned to the house, I nearly broke. Thomas requested to keep it for the children's stability, and the court agreed. That house, which I had once mocked as too modest, too small, was now out of my reach. The children's bedrooms, their drawings on the fridge, the backyard where they played, it all stayed with him. I was left to figure out where I would go. By the end of the day, the judge read the ruling. Primary custody granted to Thomas, with me allowed visitation. The house and its contents awarded to him. Financial protections put in place, so I couldn't drain accounts again. Each decision was a blow, each word another cut. I wanted to shout that it was unfair, that he was punishing me for a joke. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the joke. It was all of it. The lies, the arrogance, the public humiliations. As the gavel came down, I looked at Thomas one last time, hoping for some sign of triumph or anger that I could use against him. But there was nothing. He stood, collected his papers, and left the courtroom without even glancing in my direction. The silence followed me out, heavier than any insult. That was his revenge, not shouting, not fighting, but calmly taking everything back while I was left with nothing but my own excuses. The motel room smelled of bleach and damp carpet, a far cry from the house I once mocked as too small. The single lamp flickered above me as I sat on the edge of the bed, divorce decree spread across the cheap blanket. I stared at the words until they blurred, but they never changed. Primary custody, Thomas Dawn. Marital home awarded, Thomas Dawn. Financial protections in place, all for Thomas Dawn. My name was there too, but only as a reminder of what I had lost. I told myself it was temporary, that I would find a way to fix it, but even I didn't believe it anymore. Victor, the man I once leaned on for validation, was gone. Ethan had blocked me weeks earlier. My brother Marcus wouldn't return my calls. My parents spoke only about the children when I tried reaching out. Even my closest friends, the ones who used to laugh at my stories, had drifted away. Nobody wanted to be tied to me now. The isolation was suffocating. I could hear it in the silence after my phone buzzed, and I saw it was only a spam message, not a real person reaching out. I told myself Thomas had manipulated everyone, that he had played the victim so well that they all believed his version of the story. I whispered it aloud, hoping it would sound convincing, but the echo in the empty room mocked me. Deep down, I knew the truth. He didn't need to twist anything. He had simply laid out the facts, while I had already written the story of my own downfall. The hardest part wasn't losing the house or the money, it was losing the children. I was allowed to see them, yes, but only on the schedule written in those court papers. No more tucking them in every night, no more breakfasts before school. When I called, Mila sounded polite but distant, as if she had already grown older in a matter of weeks. Jacob said he missed me, but then quickly added that Daddy had helped him build a fort in the living room. I smiled through the phone, telling him that sounded fun, but when the call ended, I broke. I tried telling myself it was unfair, that mothers should never be pushed aside, but the truth was even the children were calmer with him. The judge had seen it, the teachers had seen it, and now I had to live with it. I wanted to believe I could win them back, but what could I offer them here, in this dingy room with its rattling air conditioner and faded curtains? Some nights, I replayed the moment it all started. That dinner, that laugh, that joke about Ethan. I told myself it was just a joke, that no one should have taken it seriously, but the memory of Thomas's face haunted me. He hadn't been angry. He hadn't shouted. He had simply looked at me, as if he finally saw me clearly, and then he walked away. I thought his silence was weakness, but it turned out to be the sharpest weapon he had. I tried to spin it differently in my head. I told myself I had chosen passion, that I wanted more from life, that Thomas was too small for me. But if that were true, why was I here alone, clinging to excuses that no one believed anymore? Passion had left me stranded. Ambition had turned into mockery, and silence had become the final answer. My parents stopped answering when I called late at night. Marcus changed his number. Even Elaine, who had never liked me, wouldn't bother speaking my name. The only thing left with my name on it was the decree lying on the bed. I poured myself a glass of cheap wine from the store across the street and told myself I still had time, that people would see I wasn't the villain. But no one was watching anymore. The stage I had built for myself, where I laughed at Thomas and bragged about Ethan, had crumbled. There was no audience left to applaud. As I sat there, I realized Thomas had never needed to fight me. He didn't need to shout or argue or try to win me back. He simply stepped away, gathered what he needed, and let the truth speak for itself. And now, here I was, staring at the final proof of what silence can do. The motel clock ticked loudly in the corner, each second reminding me of how far I had fallen. I thought I had control, but he ended it all without lifting his voice. My last shred of pride was gone, and all I had left were the empty echoes of a joke that cost me everything. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching. Ching, 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 ching.